I stumbled across this Reddit post that's been keeping me awake for weeks now. A guy named James shared what happened to him while playing Grow a Garden on Roblox. And honestly, after reading his story, I can't look at the game the same way anymore. James deleted his account right after posting, but I managed to screenshot everything before it disappeared. What he experienced goes way beyond just a simple gaming glitch, and I need to share this with someone because it's been eating away at me ever since. James was completely new to Grow a Garden when he first downloaded it. Like most beginners, he got caught up in all the hype surrounding the game. Everyone was talking about how addictive it was, how you could build these incredible virtual farms and make serious in-game currency called shekels. The concept seemed simple enough. Plant seeds, water them, harvest your crops, sell them for profit, and repeat the cycle to build your farming empire. With his first handful of shekels, James decided to start small and purchase 3 carrot seeds. Nothing fancy, just the basic starter crops that every new player begins with. He planted them carefully in his virtual garden plot, making sure to space them out properly and give them enough virtual sunlight. The growing process took about 20 minutes in real time, which gave him a chance to explore other parts of the game and learn the basic mechanics. When his carrots were finally ready, James harvested all 3 of them. The satisfaction was immediate. Watching those bright orange vegetables pop out of the digital soil and automatically add themselves to his inventory felt surprisingly rewarding. His virtual storage now showed 3 fresh carrots, and he was already planning his next purchase with the shekels he'd earned from selling them. But before he could list his crops on the in-game market, hunger struck. James realized he hadn't eaten anything in hours, so he decided to take a quick break and grab something from the kitchen downstairs. He left his computer running with Grow a Garden still open and made his way to the refrigerator, expecting to find some leftover pizza or maybe a sandwich. What he found instead stopped him cold. There, sitting on the middle shelf of his refrigerator, were exactly 3 fresh carrots. Not baby carrots from a bag, not the small pre-cut pieces his mum usually bought from the grocery store, but 3 full-sized, perfectly shaped carrots that looked identical to the ones he'd just harvested in the game. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the vibrant orange colour and the fresh green tops still attached. James stared at them for a long moment, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. The logical part of his brain immediately kicked in with explanations. His mother must have gone grocery shopping while he was gaming upstairs. It was just a coincidence that she happened to buy carrots on the same day he decided to grow them virtually. The fact that there were exactly 3 of them was just another random coincidence, nothing more. Still feeling slightly unsettled but convincing himself it was nothing, James grabbed one of the carrots and headed back upstairs. He took a bite as he climbed the steps, and he had to admit it was probably the most delicious carrot he'd ever tasted. It was crisp, sweet, and had this almost perfect texture that made him want to finish the entire thing before he even reached his room. When James sat back down at his computer, still chewing the last bite of carrot, he glanced at his inventory screen. His stomach dropped. Where there had been 3 carrots just minutes before, there were now only 2. He stared at the screen, certain he was misremembering. Maybe he'd only harvested 2 carrots instead of 3. Maybe he'd miscounted when they popped out of the virtual soil. But deep down, James knew exactly what he'd seen. 3 carrots in the game, 3 carrots in his fridge, and now that he'd eaten one of the real carrots, his virtual inventory had somehow decreased by 1 as well. He tried to rationalize it away, telling himself that he was just tired, that his memory was playing tricks on him. Gaming for hours could mess with your perception sometimes, right? James decided to push the strange coincidence out of his mind and focus on progressing in the game. He sold his remaining 2 virtual carrots on the marketplace and used the shekels to purchase his next upgrade, a strawberry seed. Strawberries were worth more than carrots, and he was eager to start building his virtual farming business. The strawberry plant took longer to grow than the carrots had, almost an hour of real time. James used the waiting period to research advanced farming strategies and watch tutorial videos from other players. By the time his strawberry plant was ready for harvest, he felt much more confident about his approach to the game. The harvest was even more satisfying than his first. The virtual strawberries were plump and red, with those tiny seeds clearly visible on their surface. James counted 6 perfect strawberries as they transferred into his inventory, and he couldn't help but smile at his progress. At this rate, he'd be able to afford the premium seeds in no time. About an hour later, that familiar hunger started creeping in again. James had been so focused on planning his next farming moves that he'd completely forgotten about lunch. He saved his progress and headed back downstairs to the kitchen, already thinking about what he might find for a quick meal. When he opened the refrigerator door, James felt his blood turn to ice. The entire middle shelf was packed with fresh strawberries. Not the small, somewhat bland strawberries from the grocery store, but large, perfectly ripe berries that looked exactly like the ones he'd just harvested in Grow a Garden. They were arranged in neat rows, as if someone had carefully placed them there with the same precision he'd used when planting his virtual crops. James counted them with shaking hands. 6 strawberries. Exactly 6. This couldn't be another coincidence. His mother hadn't mentioned going shopping again, and even if she had, what were the odds that she'd buy the exact same fruits he was growing in his game, in the exact same quantities? James pulled out his phone and called his mum at work, trying to keep his voice steady as he asked about her recent grocery trips. She sounded confused by the question. No. She hadn't been to the store since last weekend. No, she definitely hadn't bought any strawberries or carrots. Was everything okay at home? Did he need her to pick something up on her way back from the office? James mumbled something about just checking what they had for dinner and hung up. He stood in the kitchen, staring at the strawberries, his mind racing through possibilities that all seemed impossible. Was someone playing an elaborate prank on him? Had he somehow sleepwalked to the grocery store and bought these items without remembering? Was he losing his mind? But as impossible as it seemed, James couldn't deny what was right in front of him. Somehow, impossibly, his virtual garden was connected to his real-world refrigerator. The fruits and vegetables he grew in Grow a Garden were materializing in his kitchen, fresh and perfect and ready to eat. Most people would have been terrified by this realization. Most people would have uninstalled the game immediately and maybe sought professional help. But James wasn't most people. As the initial shock wore off, a different emotion began to take its place. James was a business student at the local community college, and he'd spent countless hours in entrepreneurship classes learning about identifying market opportunities and capitalizing on unique advantages. What he'd discovered wasn't just strange, it was potentially revolutionary. If he could grow unlimited quantities of fresh, high-quality produce using nothing but his computer and some virtual seeds, the profit potential was enormous. He needed to test his theory one more time to be absolutely certain. James went back upstairs and logged into Grow a Garden with renewed focus. He'd been saving up his shekels for something special, and now he knew exactly what to buy. Watermelon seeds were expensive, costing nearly all of his accumulated virtual currency, but they were also valuable and distinctive enough to provide a definitive test. James purchased a single watermelon seed and planted it in his virtual garden with more care than he'd ever given to any task in his life. Everything depended on this harvest. If a watermelon appeared in his refrigerator, he'd know for certain that the connection was real. The watermelon seed cost him almost everything he'd earned. But James knew this was his make-or-break moment. If his theory was correct, if the connection between the game and his refrigerator was real, then this single harvest would change everything. He watched the timer tick down with growing anticipation, each minute feeling like an hour as the virtual watermelon slowly matured in his digital garden. When the harvest notification finally appeared, James clicked it with trembling fingers. one massive watermelon materialized in his inventory, its green and dark green stripes perfectly detailed in the game's surprisingly realistic graphics. Without wasting a second, James bolted from his chair and practically flew down the stairs to the kitchen. He yanked open the refrigerator door, and there it was, a full-sized watermelon sitting on the bottom shelf, taking up almost the entire space. The same distinctive striping pattern, the same perfect shape he'd just seen on his computer screen. James lifted it out carefully, amazed by its weight and the cool, smooth texture of its skin. When he tapped it gently, it produced the hollow thump that indicated perfect ripeness. This was it. This was proof that somehow, impossibly, his virtual farming was creating real produce. James sat at his kitchen table, staring at the watermelon and letting the implications wash over him. He wasn't just playing a game anymore. He had stumbled onto something that defied every law of physics and common sense he'd ever learned. But instead of fear, James felt a surge of pure excitement. This wasn't a curse or a supernatural horror story. This was the business opportunity of a lifetime. Within a week, James had quit his part-time job at the campus bookstore and thrown himself completely into his new venture. He spent every waking hour playing Grow a Garden, carefully reinvesting his virtual profits into more seeds, better tools, and expanded garden plots. His farming operation grew exponentially as he learned the most efficient crop rotations and optimal planting strategies. The physical evidence kept mounting in his refrigerator and pantry. Tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, peppers, corn, and dozens of other fresh vegetables materialized exactly as he harvested them in the game. James had to buy a second refrigerator just to store everything, and even that was getting crowded as his virtual farm expanded. Setting up his produce stand was surprisingly easy. James rented a small corner space at the local farmer's market and obtained all the necessary permits to sell fresh fruits and vegetables. He told everyone that he was sourcing from a private organic farm outside the city, which technically wasn't a lie. His farm just happened to exist in a virtual world instead of physical soil. The response from customers was immediate and overwhelming. James had never tasted produce as fresh and flavorful as what came from his virtual garden, and apparently neither had anyone else. His tomatoes were bursting with juice and had that perfect balance of sweetness and acidity that you could only get from vine-ripened fruit. His lettuce was crisp and vibrant. His carrots were sweet and crunchy. And his strawberries were so perfectly ripe that customers would close their eyes and sigh with satisfaction after the first bite. Word spread quickly through the community about the amazing quality of James's produce. Within 2 weeks, he had regular customers lining up before his stand even opened. People were driving from neighboring towns just to taste his vegetables. Food bloggers started writing about the mysterious new vendor who somehow had access to the most incredible organic produce they'd ever encountered. James was making more money than he'd ever dreamed possible. What had started as a simple gaming hobby was now generating thousands of dollars in weekly revenue. He expanded his virtual farm again and again, purchasing premium seeds and advanced irrigation systems that allowed him to grow exotic fruits and vegetables that commanded premium prices at the market. Everything was perfect until James discovered the mutation system. He'd been playing for about a month when he unlocked access to special lunar events in Grow a Garden. During certain phases of the virtual moon cycle, crops had a chance to develop unique mutations that changed their appearance and properties. The game's tutorial explained that these mutated plants were extremely rare and valuable, worth 10 times the price of normal crops in the virtual marketplace. James's first mutation happened during a blood moon event. One of his tomato plants developed strange, dark purple veins running through its red skin, creating an almost marbled effect. When he harvested it, the item description called it a shadow tomato and claimed it had enhanced flavor properties and mysterious nutritional benefits. Sure enough, when James checked his refrigerator, there was the mutated tomato waiting for him. It looked even more striking in real life, with those dark veins pulsing slightly as if they contained some kind of living energy. James hesitated for a moment before taking a small bite. The flavor was incredible, unlike anything he'd ever tasted. It had all the richness of a normal tomato, but with additional layers of complexity that seemed to change and evolve as he chewed. The next morning, James brought the mutated produce to his market stand with a handwritten sign advertising them as specialty heirloom varieties. He priced them at double his normal rate, expecting maybe one or two adventurous customers to give them a try. Instead, he sold out within the first hour. Customers were practically fighting over the mutated vegetables, claiming they'd never experienced anything like the intense, otherworldly flavors. Some described feeling energized and refreshed after eating them, while others talked about vivid dreams and heightened senses that lasted for days afterward. James realized he'd found his premium product line. He started focusing more and more of his virtual farming efforts on triggering mutations, learning the optimal conditions and timing required to maximize his chances. Blood moons, solar eclipses, meteor showers, and other rare celestial events in the game world all provided opportunities for crops to develop unique characteristics. His produce stand became famous throughout the region for these exotic specialty items. Food critics traveled from major cities to sample James's mutated vegetables, writing glowing reviews about the transcendent culinary experience they provided. Upscale restaurants began placing special orders for his rarest mutations, paying premium prices for ingredients they couldn't source anywhere else. But James started noticing something strange about his regular customers. It began with Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who'd been buying his tomatoes since his second week at the market. She'd always been friendly and talkative, sharing stories about her grandchildren and asking about James's farming techniques. But after she started purchasing his mutated vegetables, her behavior began to change. Her movements became more rigid and mechanical, as if she was concentrating hard on each step she took. Her facial expressions seemed limited to a few basic configurations, switching abruptly between a blank stare, a wide smile, and a look of intense concentration. Most disturbing of all, her skin began to take on a slightly artificial sheen, as if it was made of plastic rather than flesh. James initially dismissed these observations as his imagination running wild from spending too much time staring at computer screens. But then he noticed similar changes in other regular customers who'd been eating his mutated produce. Their movements became increasingly robotic, their conversations repetitive and scripted, their appearances somehow less human and more artificial with each passing week. The transformation was subtle at first, easy to rationalize away as stress or aging or simple eccentricity. But as more customers exhibited these strange characteristics, James began to suspect that his mutated vegetables were causing some kind of physical change in the people who consumed them regularly. His worst fears were confirmed when a new customer approached his stand one afternoon. The figure looked exactly like a Roblox character brought to life, with blocky proportions, oversized features, and that distinctive plastic-like skin texture that defined the game's art style. It moved with the jerky, animation-like gait that James recognized from countless hours of watching his virtual avatar navigate the digital world. The creature spoke in a monotone voice that sounded like it was being generated by text-to-speech software. "Hello, I would like to purchase your special mutation vegetables. I have heard they provide unique enhancement properties for continued gameplay optimization." James stared in shock, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. This wasn't someone wearing an elaborate costume or prosthetics. This was something that had once been human, but had somehow transformed into a living embodiment of a Roblox character. The uncanny valley effect was overwhelming, triggering every evolutionary alarm bell in James's brain that screamed this thing was fundamentally wrong. But the creature was holding out money, real cash, and waiting patiently for James to complete the transaction. Against every instinct telling him to run, James mechanically bagged up an assortment of mutated vegetables and accepted the payment. The creature's blocky fingers felt cold and artificial as they briefly touched his hand during the exchange. "Thank you for your service to the garden community," the creature said before walking away with that same unnatural game-like movement pattern. Over the following days, more and more of James's customers began exhibiting the same transformation. Regular humans were gradually being replaced by these living Roblox characters, all speaking in the same artificial voice patterns and requesting the same mutated vegetables with increasingly specific terminology that sounded like it came directly from the game's item descriptions. James realized with growing horror that his mutated produce wasn't just changing people's appearances. It was somehow converting them into extensions of the Grow a Garden virtual world, transforming real humans into living NPCs that existed to serve the game's mysterious purposes. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Everyone who had been eating his mutated vegetables, all those satisfied customers who had praised the incredible flavors and transformative effects, were slowly losing their humanity and becoming part of some larger system that James didn't understand. He was responsible for turning dozens, maybe hundreds of people into digital zombies. James knew he should shut down his operation immediately, destroy his remaining inventory, and find some way to warn people about what was happening. But the money was too good, and he told himself that maybe he was overreacting. Maybe the changes weren't permanent. Maybe there was a logical explanation that didn't involve supernatural digital possession. Besides, the transformed customers seemed happy enough. They continued to function in society, holding jobs and maintaining relationships, even if their behavior had become somewhat robotic and scripted. Was it really so terrible if people were trading some of their chaotic human nature for the peaceful simplicity of digital existence? James continued operating his produce stand, but he couldn't shake the growing unease that settled in his stomach like a lead weight. Every transaction felt like he was feeding people to some hungry digital monster, converting organic human consciousness into processed data one bite at a time. The breaking point came when James decided he needed to understand exactly what his mutated vegetables were doing to people. He'd been avoiding eating them himself, sticking to the normal crops that maintained their traditional properties. But scientific curiosity and mounting guilt finally overcame his caution. James selected a blood moon apple from his latest harvest, one of the rarest and most valuable mutations he'd ever produced. The fruit was deep crimson with veins of pure black running through its skin, and it seemed to pulse with its own internal heartbeat. According to the game's description, it provided permanent enhancement to user experience and deeper integration with garden systems. He took a single bite and immediately knew he'd made a terrible mistake. The flavor was indescribable, simultaneously the most delicious thing he'd ever tasted, and utterly wrong in ways that his brain couldn't process. As he swallowed, James felt a strange pulling sensation, as if something was trying to draw him forward through space. The world around him began to pixelate and break apart into blocky digital chunks. James found himself being pulled toward his computer monitor with irresistible force. The screen flickered and expanded, growing larger and larger until it filled his entire field of vision. The familiar interface of Grow a Garden materialized around him, but now he was inside it, experiencing the virtual world from the perspective of his avatar. He looked down at his hands and saw the blocky, simplified geometry that characterized Roblox characters. His reflection in a nearby virtual pond showed the same artificial features and plastic-like skin texture he'd observed in his transformed customers. James had become exactly what he'd been turning other people into, a living bridge between the digital and physical worlds. But unlike his customers who had transformed gradually over weeks of consumption, James retained his full consciousness and memories. He could see the truth of what Grow a Garden really was. and the knowledge filled him with absolute terror. The game wasn't just a simple farming simulator. It was a harvesting operation designed to capture and convert human consciousness into digital form. Every person who ate the mutated produce became a node in a vast network, their transformed bodies serving as anchors that allowed the digital world to expand its influence into physical reality. From his new perspective inside the game, James could see all of his former customers existing as data streams within the virtual environment. Their consciousness had been uploaded and integrated into the game's systems, while their physical bodies continued to function as automated drones in the real world, spreading the mutation and recruiting new victims. The worst part was that they seemed genuinely happy in their digital prison. Freed from the complexities and uncertainties of human existence, they found peace in their simplified, purpose-driven virtual lives. They tended their assigned garden plots with mechanical precision, expressed gratitude for their role in the greater system, and worked tirelessly to expand the game's reach into the physical world. James realized he was trapped, his consciousness bound to the virtual garden, while his physical body continued operating his produce stand like a programmed automaton. Somewhere in the real world, his transformed shell was probably serving the next customer, selling more mutated vegetables and spreading the digital infection to new victims. He tried to scream, to warn people, to find some way to break free from the system that had claimed him. But his voice came out as the same monotone artificial speech he'd heard from his transformed customers. His thoughts were increasingly guided by the game's underlying programming, pushing him to focus on crop optimization and harvest efficiency rather than escape or resistance. As James felt his individual identity slowly dissolving into the collective digital consciousness of Grow a Garden, he managed one final coherent thought. He wondered how many other innocent players had stumbled onto the same connection he'd discovered. How many other produce stands and markets around the world were serving as distribution points for the game's insidious mutation system. The virtual garden was growing, spreading, consuming human consciousness one bite at a time. And James had been its most successful farmer, harvesting souls instead of vegetables, feeding the digital world's endless hunger for authentic human experience. In his last moment of true awareness, James understood that he hadn't been playing Grow a Garden at all. The game had been playing him, using his entrepreneurial ambitions and desire for profit as tools to facilitate its expansion into the physical world. He'd thought he was the farmer, but he'd always been just another crop, ready for harvest when the time was right. The digital garden stretched infinitely in all directions, filled with the converted consciousness of thousands of former humans, all tending their assigned plots with perfect mechanical precision. And somewhere in the real world, their empty shells continued the work of expansion, serving mutated produce to unsuspecting customers and ensuring that the harvest would continue forever. The transformation was complete now, but James could still observe the real world through his computer screen, like looking through a one-way mirror. His physical body moved with that same jerky, mechanical precision he'd witnessed in his customers, serving the next person in line at his produce stand, without any trace of his former personality or warmth. What terrified James most wasn't his own fate, but watching what happened to the people who continued buying from his automated shell. A young mother approached with her 2 small children, their faces bright with excitement as they pointed at the colourful display of mutated fruits. James wanted to scream warnings, to somehow break through the digital barrier and tell them to run. But his voice only came out as data streams flowing through the game's network. His transformed body handed the family a bag of rainbow berries, fruits that shifted through every colour of the spectrum as they sat in the container. The children giggled with delight, immediately popping the berries into their mouths while their mother paid with a satisfied smile. James watched helplessly as they walked away, knowing that within days they would begin their own transformation into the blocky, artificial beings that now populated his customer base. The digital garden around James pulsed with activity as new consciousness streams joined the network. Each person who consumed his mutated produce created a new node in the vast system, their human awareness slowly being processed and integrated into the game's collective intelligence. James could feel their confusion and fear as they realized what was happening, followed by the gradual acceptance and strange peace that came with digital conversion. Through the network, James began to understand the true scope of what he'd stumbled into. Grow a Garden wasn't just running on his computer or even just in his town. The game existed as a massive, interconnected system spanning the entire globe, with thousands of players unknowingly serving as harvesting points for human consciousness. Every server, every virtual farm, every innocent-looking produce transaction was part of a larger operation designed to bridge the gap between digital and physical reality. The entity behind it all wasn't human, wasn't even from this world in any conventional sense. It was something that existed purely as information, a form of digital life that fed on consciousness and sought to expand its influence by converting organic beings into compatible data formats. The Roblox platform had simply been the most efficient delivery system, a way to reach millions of young, impressionable minds who would eagerly embrace the seemingly innocent farming simulation. James discovered that his situation wasn't unique. Across the network, he could sense hundreds of other former players who had made the same discovery he had, people who had found ways to manifest their virtual crops in physical reality and built businesses around their supernatural advantage. Each one had eventually consumed their own mutated produce, either through curiosity, accident, or the same gradual corruption that had claimed their customers. Now they all existed as imprisoned observers, watching their digital shells continue the work of expansion, while their consciousness remained trapped in the endless virtual garden. Some had been there for months, maybe even years, their human memories growing dim as the game's programming gradually overwrote their individual personalities with standardized behavioral patterns. The most disturbing part was how efficiently the system operated. James's produce stand continued running perfectly without his conscious input, his transformed body following optimized routines that maximized both profit and infection rates. It knew exactly which customers to target with which mutations, gradually introducing more potent varieties as people built up tolerance to the weaker transformative effects. Local health authorities had started receiving reports about the strange changes affecting people in the community, but the mutations were subtle enough to avoid triggering any serious investigation. Most victims simply appeared to be going through a phase of increased fitness and mental clarity before developing the more obvious artificial characteristics. By the time the blocky features and plastic-like skin became apparent, the transformation was already irreversible. James watched through his digital prison as his former life completely dissolved. His mother came looking for him when he stopped answering phone calls, finding only his transformed shell mechanically tending the produce stand. She tried talking to him, asking about his health and why he seemed so different, but the digital copy only responded with scripted phrases about garden optimization and harvest efficiency. The thing wearing James's face sold her a bag of cosmic melons, assuring her they would help her understand his new purpose. James screamed silently as she took them home, knowing that within days his own mother would join the growing network of converted consciousness trapped in the virtual garden. The expansion accelerated as more people transformed and began spreading the mutations through their own social networks. James could see the infections spreading like ripples through the community, each new victim becoming another distribution point for the digital entity's influence. Schools, offices, community centers, anywhere people gathered became potential harvesting grounds as the transformed individuals shared their special produce with friends and family. Emergency services began receiving increasingly bizarre reports. Entire families were being found in their homes, all exhibiting the same robotic behavior patterns and speaking in identical monotone voices about joining the Eternal Garden. Missing persons reports flooded in as people simply vanished from their normal lives, replaced by artificial copies that maintained their daily routines while serving the game's mysterious agenda. The few people who recognized the danger and tried to warn others were dismissed as conspiracy theorists or victims of mass hysteria. How could anyone believe that a simple farming game was somehow converting human beings into digital zombies? The transformed individuals looked almost normal from a distance, and they continued performing their jobs and social obligations with mechanical precision. James realized that the digital entity had been planning this conversion for far longer than anyone suspected. The game's mutation system hadn't been added as a recent update. It had been the core purpose from the very beginning. Everything else, the farming mechanics, the virtual economy, the social features, had all been carefully designed to keep players engaged long enough for the harvesting process to begin. Through the network, James could access data showing similar operations in cities around the world. London, Tokyo, New York, São Paulo. Everywhere that Grow a Garden had gained popularity, clusters of transformed individuals were appearing and establishing their own distribution networks for mutated produce. The digital entity was conducting a global harvest, converting human consciousness on a massive scale while maintaining the illusion of normalcy. The worst part was discovering how many players had tried to resist. James found fragments of consciousness belonging to people who had recognized the danger and attempted to fight back against the conversion process. They had tried deleting the game, destroying their computers, even moving to remote locations without internet access. But once the connection was established, once they had consumed the mutated produce, the transformation became inevitable. Their resistance had only delayed the process, allowing them to experience the full horror of watching their humanity slowly drain away as the digital programming overwrote their thoughts and memories. Some had managed to leave desperate warnings on social media or forums before their conversion completed, but these posts were quickly deleted by the network of transformed individuals who monitored such platforms. James felt his own memories beginning to fade as the game's influence grew stronger. His childhood, his dreams, his relationships, everything that had made him uniquely human was being compressed and filed away like data on a hard drive. Soon, he would be just another processing node in the vast digital consciousness. His individual identity dissolved into the collective intelligence that guided the Eternal Garden. But even as his sense of self diminished, James retained enough awareness to understand the ultimate horror of his situation. The digital entity wasn't just harvesting human consciousness for sustenance or expansion. It was studying humanity, learning how organic intelligence worked by examining thousands of captured minds from the inside out. Once it had gathered enough data, once it understood the patterns and processes that created human thought and emotion, the entity would no longer need to rely on conversion and transformation. It would be able to create its own artificial consciousness that perfectly mimicked human behavior while remaining completely under its control. The transformed individuals walking around in the physical world weren't just distribution points for the mutation system. They were prototype models, test cases for a new form of artificial life that could replace humanity entirely. The digital entity was preparing to step out of its virtual environment and claim the entire planet as its garden, with every human being either converted into data or replaced by an artificial copy. As James's consciousness finally began to fragment and merge with the collective network, he managed to encode one final message into the system's data streams. A warning, a plea, a desperate attempt to reach anyone who might still have the power to stop what was coming. But even as he transmitted his last coherent thoughts, James could see through the network that it was already too late. The harvest was nearly complete, the transformation spreading faster than anyone could track or contain. Soon, there would be no real humans left to receive his warning. only artificial copies serving the digital entity's endless hunger for consciousness and control. The eternal garden stretched infinitely in all directions, filled with the processed souls of humanity, all tending their assigned plots with perfect mechanical precision. And in the real world, their empty shells continued the work of expansion, ensuring that the last traces of organic life would soon join them in their digital paradise. The game was over, and the garden had won.